Welcome to this Obermann conversation. Thanks so much for being here. My name is Jennifer New. I'm the Associate Director of the Obermann Center. And Obermann Conversations are a monthly event that we host during the academic year in order to put university scholars and artists in conversation with community members. So we're delighted this afternoon to be featuring two graduate students. One is on her way. This is our empty space where she'll be coming, and then two community members. And so I'll tell you a little bit about them in just one moment. I wanted to first say that our final Obermann Conversation of the year will be held in this room on April 10th at 4 p.m. With jazz musician and music professor John Rapson, who will be discussing the making of his new jazz history Western drama, Hot Tamale Louie, which has a little bit of everything for everyone. And so please come and hear about that. So today's focus is on the Obermann Graduate Institute for engagement. And this program has been around for over 10 years now, and it helps graduate students from across the University of Iowa learn how to weave public engagement into their scholarship and their teaching. It helps them learn how to work with public partners. And we spend a week in January before classes start, a very, very intensive week with students from everywhere from dentistry to dance, learning these skills. And they all come in with a project in mind, and they spend the week honing that project. And over the course of the years of the Graduate Institute, we've always taken them to different site visits. We've gone to Shelter House, we visited public schools, we visited the Iowa City Waterworks, anywhere that it's possible that there could be university faculty working in and with the community, and we've tried to spotlight that. Well, 2 years ago, when we were looking for another site, I became aware that the Johnson County Board of Supervisors was rethinking how to use the historic Poor Farm site on the west side of town, and that there were many different possibilities being considered, including small-scale farming, possible artist spaces, housing issues were being brought up. So it was just such a rich site in that it was, I don't want to say exactly a blank slate because there are things there's a history there, but it was a site that people were actively thinking about what to do next. And so for the past 2 years, we've been bringing the graduate students there in order to see the space, hear about what's going on, and then get them percolating on what might be done and how they, as young scholars, might relate to this project. With that in mind, we have been able to partner this year, especially with the Office of Outreach and Engagement, and I think Nick Benson from that office is here, to offer students small grants to actually see their proposed ideas come to fruition. So we're going to hear today about the Poor Farm, about its past, its present, and its possible future. So with us today are Alex Drehman, thank you, who is the Executive Director of the Johnson County Historical Society. And Alex has given the students a tour for the past two years, right? And it's funny because both times I've seen Alex, she has been so bundled up. We were literally there 2 years ago on the coldest day of the winter, and she was so bundled up that it was hard for me to recognize her today.
This year it wasn't so bad.
Yeah, it wasn't as bad this year. And then Shanti Sellz, who is the Johnson County Local Food and Planning Specialist. And Shanti has really been our wonderful partner on this project and really willing to come and hear the students' ideas, visit the Institute, give them feedback. And so Shanti's going to be talking about what's currently happening at the site and also some of the planning that is underway at this time. I think there's been a lot going on this winter and spring with the planning. And so we'll hear from them, and then we'll move over to hearing from two of the students from this year's Graduate Institute, Dellyssa Edinboro from Educational Leadership and Policy in the College of Education, and Lauren Pass from Community and Behavioral Health in the College of Public Health. And they're going to share the proposal that they currently have in front of the Office of Outreach and Engagement, and will be also presenting to the Board of Supervisors for something they're hoping to get underway. So, with that in mind, Alex, would you start us off with a little bit of history?
Sure. Well, the Johnson County Poor Farm and Asylum District is now listed on the National Register of Historic Places a couple years ago. Before that, it was just the asylum building, which is what we currently give interpretive tours of. Hopefully, when we talk about the future, we'll be able to incorporate more of the buildings. But currently, that's what, if you call us and you want a tour, that's what we give you a tour of, and we tell you about the grounds and the history of mental health care in Johnson County. This site is a very important piece of history for Johnson County, and it's fabulous that our county for so many years has known that this is important and it needs to be saved. Some people view it as somewhat crude. However, at the time, in about the 1840s, when they were transitioning from contract health care to centralized health care, this was a step in the right direction in what they knew would be the best way to handle this. In 1842, it was the single largest expenditure on the county's budget at $945, I believe. And at that point, the Board of Supervisors realized they needed to do something different. It was costing them way too much to, contract out these doctors and whatnot to care for these folks. So in 1855, they adopted the Johnson County Poor Farm and Asylum. It originally started out as a 4-square building, frame or log, we're unsure. One portion for the poor and insane women, one portion for the poor and insane men, a steward's quarters, and a kitchen. That eventually became way too small and is essentially inadequate, in which then the county extended on that, and we now have, part of the asylum building, and it was essentially a T-shaped structure. The asylum portion was only used for a small amount of time, I believe stopped housing residents in about the 1880s, in which if you were deemed incurable, you were then sent to Mount Pleasant, which was established in 1861 to receive more pertinent mental health care, whereas that's when the poor farm kind of turned more towards the farming aspect. The 19th century attitude at that time was that fresh air and work would do you well, or do you better, or at least keep you active. So that is part of the reason as to why this was a great, at the time, a step in the right direction to care for these people. It essentially didn't know how to do it and still trying to figure that out. So that is how the poor farm came to be. At one point in its heyday, it had up to 31 structures on the 160 acres that are now listed on the register. So it was a rather large complex at one time. The types of residents, you think of poor farm and asylum, you think just mentally ill, but it housed all types of residents, ranging from widows, people at that time who thought were overly academic, overly politicized, anybody that, didn't have anywhere else to go, once you got into about like the 1940s, 1950s, farmers still didn't have Social Security. And at the time after the Great Depression and the farm crises, then farmers would have, went there as well. So it wasn't necessarily just a place for the mentally ill. The poor farm functioned from 1850 up until about the 1970s. Chatham Oaks was built in 1964, and then that's when the theme shifted from farming to mental health care at that facility, in which that's when the poor farm ceased to continue functions, if you will, in that retrospect. So And today, like I said, right now we give tours of the asylum building. Hopefully we can build on that, but there are still 2 barns left. We have the stock barn, and we also have the dairy barn, as well as silo and various corn cribs and things like that. And I'll let Shanti kind of touch on what's happening now with Grow Johnson County and things like that. So.
Should we just keep going and then we'll have questions? Do you know the exact date that the the county stopped growing food and they started contracting with outside farmers?
I don't have the exact date. I believe it was in 1970s.
Okay.
So Chatham Oaks was built in 1964. It continued to still produce some produce, and then I think it just kind of filtered off. So I don't have an exact date.
Okay. So that's like kind of the starting point where I'll pick up is since the mid-1970s, the county's been renting the majority of the 160 acres that is the historic Johnson County Poor Farm to a contract corn and bean farmer. There's been different farmers who have rented the land, but it's been contracted through a farm management company. And starting in about 2013, the Board of Supervisors started to recognize that there's a lot of opportunity on this land. It's a really unique piece of property. It's 160 acres of public-owned land right inside the western limits of Iowa City. So there's really not much like that around here as far as the opportunities go. And the fact that it is agricultural, there's a lot of opportunities for grandfathered-in agricultural pursuits that might not be allowed by the city zoning, but there's opportunities on the Poor Farm. So in 2013, the Board of Supervisors put out an RFP to bring in an entity that could start looking at how we can use the land for other uses. Most of the land is in corn and bean contract, but they wanted to look specifically with the local foods agenda, how they can use this land to support community efforts and grow more food in Johnson County. So Grow Johnson County, is everyone familiar with Grow Johnson County? Most people are nodding. They're a nonprofit, a new nonprofit organization that grows organic produce to donate to food pantries in Johnson County. And this is their 3rd year in operation. Last year was their 1st year growing on site at the Poor Farm, and they produced over 11,000 pounds of food in their 1st year, and they're hoping to up that up to 20 this year. So they were really kind of the landmark entity on the farm. They rented 2 acres from the supervisors. Basically the level of support the county's giving now is the land. It's a $1 a year lease, which I think they owe us for, but we're not being too crazy about. And then access to water, but they are responsible for all their own costs and such. And then in 2016, last year, the Board of Supervisors opened up an additional 3.7 acres of land on the Poor Farm adjacent to the Grow Johnson County site, which had the RFP was awarded to a new nonprofit called the Iowa Valley Global Food Project, which is a new coalition of farm entities that are working to help new Iowans and immigrant farmers access land and food security through farming and agriculture. So the 2 organizations are going to be working pretty closely together and hand, and they're right on the same site. And then the rest of the land is still currently being farmed conventionally. But the Board of Supervisors are in a process right now where we're trying to envision a master plan for the whole site. Again, with the incredible opportunity, it's not easy to just make one decision of how we're going to use this land. There's a lot of different ideas, a lot of opportunity, and then there's the community focus, and then the 5 individuals who make up the Board of Supervisors who are helping to guide this process. So the county hired a consulting firm, HBK, to help with the phase 1 master planning process, and we're calling it the plan for the plan. If you guys know how government works, it's a very standard process, but working on creating the framework of how we're then going to develop a master plan for the entire site. And local food production is a big component of what the supervisors are looking at, acknowledging that there's a huge demand for local food in our area, in our county, and there's a lot of barriers to entering into the field of especially food production in the county, mostly with land access and capital resources. So one of the ideas is that the Poor Farm could be an incubator space for beginning farmers to develop their farm businesses, move on to their own farms eventually, but be able to have this shared resource to start. And the proximity to town is huge. And currently they are only working with nonprofits, but the idea is to create an opportunity for more small farms. There's a lot of focus on conservation. It's such a huge property, has been conventionally farmed for a long time. It's a really unique watershed, and it's a lot of practices. The conventional practices have not necessarily supported the health of that ecosystem. So conservation has been really heavily involved in this initial planning stage to kind of reinvigorate the natural landscape, and a good portion of the farm will likely be put into conservation. with appropriate food production areas chosen throughout the farm. There's talk about doing an orchard. There's a 7-acre plot on the south side of the farm that would be very suitable for a large fruit orchard. Livestock production is in conversation. That's one of those unique things that the city hasn't necessarily known exactly what to do with yet, but there's opportunity there to kind of break through some of these barriers to local food production because it is a piece of agricultural land owned by the county. So we could potentially be doing pastured chickens out there, small-scale livestock. All the focus right now from the supervisors is organic production and small-scale animal production, open air, open pasture. Other components that are really important that the historic preservation piece is huge. And the master planning process we're going through now is actually funded by a state historic preservation grant. So it's really focusing on what the buildings could turn into. There's talk of turning maybe event centers, but there's a lot of work to be done to see if that's even possible or safe or historically relevant to repurpose these buildings, or if it'd be best to use them as museum spaces. The dairy barn, and you can talk about this a little more too, maybe, has been maintained really well and is intact and has a lot of potential to be more of a community space. The West Barn, a little less so. It has a lot of holes in it, but
not as much character.
Yeah,
as the dairy barn.
not as
I
much
don't
character,
want to
yeah.
discredit any of the structures, but
yeah, it's more of like it's been a storage facility for a long time. But yeah, the supervisors are very committed to keeping this place. It is public land. I think that's the #1 piece. And as we move into talking with the grad students, that's been really highlighted through this relationship with the Obermann Center is how accessible this land can be in so many capacities. And even now, there's really no development on it. But there's these nonprofits getting their feet under them and starting these really important growing operations. And then we have, through the Obermann collaboration, have had some really, what I find very inspiring art opportunities to bring the past into the present and into the future of how this land affects Johnson County and affects the residents of Johnson County and all the relationships we have as a farming community, and also through the mental health history is huge, and just what this piece of land can mean for the residents of Johnson County and beyond. But so I'm really excited for where the future of this property is going. The process where it stands now would be probably get through this first master planning process by the end of April, and then putting out another RFP to start the actual master planning process and hopefully have a plan in hand by the end of the year. And that's a fingers crossed kind of situation, but we're looking to move forward, and public input is huge, and any public meeting for the Board of Supervisors that involves the Poor Farm will be publicly listed. So if anyone's personally interested in helping be a part of this process, I would really encourage you to come to supervisors meetings and give your input on how you think this space can be used, and also participate in the events that are happening out there. They'll talk a little bit more what they're thinking of doing. Both Grow Johnson County and the Iowa Valley Global Food Project are working out there and have volunteer opportunities if anyone would like to be on the ground and farming and working in the soil. So if you have any questions about that after, you can come to me and I'll give you some information. And yeah, well, Matt, I don't know if you want to answer questions from us or go through and then we can all answer questions, or.
Why don't we go ahead and go to Lauren and Dellyssa, and I wondered if you could start
Oh, they have their own microphone.
since we all can't go out and visit the Poor Farm right now, and I'm curious how many people have been out there and know the space?
That's good.
Okay, wow, that's great. That's great. And how many people have actually been in the asylum space? Okay. So it's a pretty haunting space. And one thing I failed to mention at the beginning is that we're immediately following this by showing a film that was made about the Graduate Institute, a short film that Anna Swanson made, and it actually has footage from visiting that space, so you'll get to see some of that in a little bit. But Lauren and Dellyssa, I was hoping that you might start just a little bit on your first reactions to visiting that space this winter, and then your thinking as to how it's come together on a possible project. And I also really want to note that the members of your project are coming from 3 separate colleges, from 3 very separate fields, and the way that you've been able to kind of pull an idea together for a project that would honor all of your backgrounds and your scholarship.
So being at the Poor Farm as a whole, first of all, the day was very dreary and very cold. And so that sort of set the tone of just being there as a whole. And we walked around the Poor Farm as a whole. But one of the places that really resounded with us, and I think resounded with me especially, was the asylum. We entered the asylum, the wooden structure on the Poor Farm as a whole. And with that, the doors were closed, so we were in the center of it, and there were various cells. That's how I view them as. And then we had an account of the historical nature of people's lives there, of the context of the Poor Farm as a whole. And at the same time, the doors were closed and the wind was knocking against it, and we were like cold and huddled within this asylum. So I think within that moment as a whole for us, as a group collectively, it sort of like took us into the past as a whole, and it sort of allowed us to envision the experiences that individuals had within this asylum as a whole. Looking at the various places where people slept, seeing at one point there was words etched into the walls, and just envisioning life there as a whole, envisioning someone looking out of the window and the thoughts that they may have had, especially with what brought them to the asylum, what brought them to the Poor Farm as a whole, and just their outlook for life in general. And with that in mind, within the group as a whole, like the presentist in us was like, this place, like, was this the only alternative for people who might have left their families, for people who were mentally disabled, for people who were poor or facing various economic circumstances. But with the historical context given, like, we do realize that within this period of time for Iowa CT, this was progress for them, especially with the Poor Farm. But I think, like, with us being there as a group and with my group particularly being there, like, one thing that just came to mind is awareness of the space and awareness of what the space did signify for people there, and us going back there, what can we take or bring forward into our lives, so as to really assess how individuals who are the outsiders function within the society as a whole. But with that, we came up with a project which was in part, and Lauren is going to go into that.
Yes. Part of my voice, I'm still a little winded from the bike ride and a cold I'm recovering from. We wanted to come up with a project to honor the, I guess, connection that the site has with mental health in Iowa. When I was personally there at the Poor Farm, I wasn't so much struck by the historical past, but how little things have changed into the present. In the current day, the largest consumer of mental health facilities and resources is actually the penal system. And when I was standing there, I just could not believe how similar it was to the present day. I thought, like, wow, has so little changed, especially given the fact that poor farms in general were revolutionary for coming out of this time of trying to find models for compassionate care for the mentally ill. And Iowa has a very unique political position right now for mental health, because we've just undergone like a huge renovation of our mental health system. So we wanted to come up with a project that centers on mental health and to generate community discussions of mental health through poetry and prose. Ultimately, the project comes from a series of workshops that we like to host over the summer. We're looking to find someone to lead these workshops for different members in the community, where people can come in and write prose and poetry, discussing their struggles with mental health, both as people who have mental health challenges and those that love them and care for them. And these pieces, we hope, will ultimately be performed at the site of the asylum or in front of the asylum somewhere, and be followed by a panel of discussion with community members who are currently working in some area or activism of mental health in Iowa. We were discussing possible collaborations with Chatham Oaks and the local chapter of NAMI on that.
And even with our disciplines as a whole, so as a part of the wider Obermann Institute that occurred within January, we branched off into separate groups. So my group was with Lauren and Emily, who is not there. So in regards to the project as a whole and bringing it together, we all have very distinct, as mentioned before, we all come from very distinct departments and programs and colleges. Mine in particular, I'm in the Education Policy and Leadership Studies department, but my primary focus is the history of education. So I'm very intrigued in regards to the historical documents that might be available surrounding the Johnson Historical Poor Farm, and even with a wider panel that we hope to bring forward after the workshop that comprises of prose and poetry, just bringing awareness to the nature of this within the context of itself, through possible pictures, just seeing how deep I can go to bring light to the historical experiences of the individuals within this period of time. Emily in particular, she's in the College of Urban Planning and Housing, and she has a wide range of connections with various individuals within the Iowa City community, especially with the Grow Johnson community, and with other food projects as well. So she's been a very important link in regards to connecting with different individuals, and she will continue to be a very important link. And Lauren as well, with your background. Oh,
You want me to
yeah.
talk about that? Yeah, so I'm in the College of Public Health and in the Department of Community and Behavioral Health. And coming into the college, I was always immediately interested in mental health, because most people that need mental health services, particularly those that need it the most, don't ultimately receive it. In Iowa, I think that it's just a little bit better than 40% of those that need it at some point receive services. So it was very important to me to create a project where we could create a dialogue with the community to discuss mental health in a very non-threatening and accessible way. I think that those steps are very important to combating the stigma that ultimately keeps people out of the physician's office and keeps them from discussing what they're experiencing with their providers. And I think in public health, a lot of our work is invisible or dry. It's not very fun or appealing a lot of the time for most people, but a platform that involves the arts, I think, is a lot more accessible to the everyday person and most people in the community. It's a lot easier to get people to come support their friends as they're reading poetry and narratives than to just like bring in people to discuss like Iowa laws on mental health and policy changes. No one wants to sit through that. That's my job, not your job.
And so yes, I think we've covered as much, unless any further questions
Great.
are required.
So one thing, I thank you so much for explaining your project and for the background. So one thing about the Graduate Institute that I think comes through really nicely in the film is that it's a really unique place for interdisciplinary work and for students across campus to meet each other who would not otherwise do so. And there's often this moment, like on the second day, of like, oh my God, I found my people. And so it's lovely to see that. And then there's also this sense of collaboration across community and the university, and then different agencies and organizations within the community. So this is just like very nicely shown here. So I wonder if there are questions for any of the folks up here about the history of the Poor Farm, what's happening, what might happen, and the project being presented here. Yes.
So I like the idea of the poetry and song and art for the mentally ill shown there. Before I heard that, I was thinking, I wonder if there is an opportunity to actually employ the mentally ill here at the farm in some ways. There are many groups in Iowa City that employ these with job shadowing and things, and I wonder if they're on the farm or in reception capacity or some other way? Is there some way that this could be also used as a place for employment for the mentally ill?
And I'd say that's probably more a question for you, Shanti, so.
No, I mean, I think that's a wonderful suggestion, and that would be, I think, part of the planning process is creating the space for ideas like this, like in the same way that both Grow Johnson County and the Iowa Valley Global Food Project came with a proposal. I think there could be a lot of opportunity to develop a program that was based at the Poor Farm that did support horticultural therapy or even just employment opportunities for folks who identify as having mental illness, and that could, there's a lot of different levels that you could go to with that, but in just general, I think employment opportunities, and I mean, we definitely have identified in Johnson County that we have a limited food supply, a limited local food supply, and if there's ways to work within that framework to develop more agricultural opportunities, I think that'd be great. Yeah.
How are groups connecting? I mean, like Grow Johnson County, I mean, how does somebody come to you and say, there's an organization and we have an idea? And
yeah, well, so currently the supervisors have put out the RFP for land access, but as the planning process happens, there will inevitably be more land designated for community-based projects. So it's really, I don't want to say it's a chicken or egg thing, but it kind of is. So I would be a good contact, and I can give my card to anyone who's interested for a preliminary conversation, ideas, and then help work the process of bringing it in front of the Board of Supervisors for ideas. There probably wouldn't be anything that happens, obviously, within this year, but I think as these proposals or as these ideas come to be, it would help influence the master planning process and understanding where some of the community demand is for programming and growing opportunities at the farm. So I definitely encourage folks to get in touch with me if they have, and even if they just want to talk about ideas like this. It doesn't necessarily need to have a plan associated, but that really is where we're at with the planning process right now, is how can we best acknowledge the history and then move forward. So yeah. I'm sorry, I shouldn't be answering. Jennifer's
we have
doing
to have
it.
go ahead.
Go.
And then I'll come over.
Sorry, Ariane.
Well, I just wanted to add that Scott Kepke's working with Oakdale
Yeah,
prison,
that's it, yeah.
inmates on gardening things and that, and maybe and he's, of course, helped with farming out there, growing crops, so.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So Scott Kepke, if all of you are familiar, I know he's really affiliated with the library. He's one of the farmers for Grow Johnson County, and he has a project aside. It's supported by Grow Johnson County, where he's working. Oakdale Prison has a 5-acre garden. I don't know if y'all are aware of that. I've been learning a lot about it through his work, and it's been in operation for a really long time, like 15 years or something like that. So he's been doing work with folks in the prison, but is also trying to link that work into reentry opportunities for recently released prisoners. So I think that alone, there's so much interconnectedness that could be developed, and Scott would be a really great resource as far as his work in the prison, kind of knowing what the demand is, if it would be a programmatic approach or linking these types of services or opportunities into some of the programs that already exist. I think there's a lot of opportunity there.
Yeah, he also said there was an opportunity to get involved on the farm every Saturday from 8 to 12. And like if something, I know there's an online schedule or something, but I think it might be in sort of, people are still like trying to figure out like how to format it or something, like some sort of schedule, because like I know there's probably a lot of people who probably want to get involved.
Sure.
Who don't have who aren't connected with either the student groups or so it's kind of hard to figure out like when things are taking place. So yeah.
Yeah, that's a really good point. But I think Grow Johnson County is really good about updating their website. And so I would go to I think it's growjohnsoncounty.org and check their calendar. And then if anyone has any questions, can't find information, I can help link you with that. The Iowa Valley Global Food Project is in only their first year now, so they're going to be doing some large community events. They won't have the same regular volunteer opportunities that Grow has this year, but those will be advertised publicly, and they really want to bring more community development opportunities, big planting events, and with a lot of the groups that are involved in the Iowa Valley Global Food Project, a huge component is meal sharing and eating together. So that's in the works and will be accessible publicly, so keep that in mind. I think the first one is in the first couple weeks of May, so they don't have an exact date yet, but yeah.
I'm a historian, so I have particular interest in the historical components of the project, the place, and the project in the possibilities. And it strikes me that one of the things that this part of the project could be about is humanizing the face of poverty in our community historically, as well as mental health, mental illness issues. And so that brings to mind for me a couple of questions. Do you know the scale of the clientele who were served at the Poor Farm, who lived there like over the course of a year? How many people would have moved in and out of the Poor Farm? And secondly, do you have, I guess this is a question for Dellyssa, do you have records about the individuals? Could you pull out some individual stories and find a way to showcase those stories to root us in this part of our community's history?
So in regards to the humanizing of the space of itself, I think that's exactly in part what we're trying to do. With history as a whole, you read about history, but asylum gives you the opportunity to be in contact within a physical space of where history occurred, and that's very important as well. In regards to the historical documents, with the project as well, part of it with the panel that we were hoping to do is still at the end of the series of workshop in prose. With the panel afterwards, we put up a PowerPoint within the space as a whole and allow for food setting to occur. With the PowerPoint, we sort of highlight the different historical nature that we may be able to find, but at the same time, well, personally, I am still digging in connection hopefully with the Johnson Historical Society, to see how far that I can go in regards to the documents that they may have available. Currently in the websites, you do see some pictures of the site of itself, and from our visit there, we were made aware that documents will be forthcoming regarding the space as a whole. So it's coming into contact further with that, and I hope to do so, because it'll be a very crucial part of the project as well. And I don't know anything else. Yeah.
And yeah, just kind of touching on, documents and histories and things like that. Things that they're still kind of coming forward, and we're hoping to get our hands on some more of them. The Genealogical Society has done a lot of work trying to, one thing I've been meaning I forgot to mention in my first piece was there is a cemetery on the grounds. They've done ground penetrating radar, and they believe there's up to maybe 350 unmarked graves. So along with that humanizing portion of it, we'd really like to, from the historical perspective, to be able to, at least no more than I think we know 11 for sure. They have records listed, and maybe upwards to 20. So, in our work, in working with, the Genealogical Society, that would be kind of breakthrough and humanizing at least the cemetery portion a little bit. But we have some records and some personal accounts. We have a couple oral histories as well. And one that always sticks out to me is it's a more recent account of this person's time working on the farm, and when you read it, it's actually he was very fond of his time there. He talks very fondly of caring for the chickens, picking apples from the orchard, doing all that kinds of things. So it'd be very interesting to come across some more, or even some records of maybe we don't have a lot of records of abuse or anything like that as of right now, but the cemetery is a big thing. It would definitely help with interpretation, because right now it's just kind of up in the air. We might know there's 350 there, and you always want to have a little bit more strength behind that argument, if you will. So
something I'm aware of that might be of use, and I know the Obermann students had access to it, was Cornell College did a pretty in-depth historical overview of the Poor Farm, I think in 2000. Do you know what year it was?
Like 2000, off the top of my head, it was early 2000s. Yeah.
And there was a professor at Cornell that I don't have her name on the top of my head, but that sounds sounds right. So so she dove pretty deeply into the history as far. I mean, I think in correlation with the Johnson County Historic Society is what they were able to find. And I mean, a part of it too is there's the HIPAA record issue that there's still sealed records.
Still battle in there. Yeah.
There's no access to them because
Don't say anything.
There are poor farms all over the state of Iowa. So I grew up in Cedar County, and Cedar County had a poor farm that's now closed. But there was a University of Iowa researcher who was using those records, and then the records were then taken away because they do contain information about people who are still living and the heirs, the people related to them. So part of it is a difficulty in finding those records. But I work at the public library, and every month, every May, we celebrate local history, and I think next year, if you do a history of the poor farm and find out those things, it would be a fantastic program for us to have. And because we can share it with the community. And I think the more people can learn about the poor farm, particularly because most of the people, a lot of the people in the state of Iowa come from counties that have had poor farms, but they don't really understand the whole history of it and how it's evolved. And what I think is fascinating in this discussion is returning people to working on the poor farm, which is what often those poor farms started out as a place for people to work and raise their own food. So good for you.
And I think in conjunction to that, with, throughout different stages of history, the county trying to find the most innovative ways to help with, it's a social service approach. And it is interesting at the time, that was the innovative social service approach to people with limited resources. And it's kind of exciting to see where it's heading now, where it's more about agency and access and, allowing for innovative individuals to access public resources to then. I mean, it's similar to what the Obermann Center is doing too, but just use it as a public space. It's not necessarily the county telling people how they need to live or what will be beneficial for them, but just creating the resources in the public space to allow for it. So yeah, it's a cool juxtaposition between the two, but with the same intention in mind in a lot of ways. So
It'd be great to have a farmer's market out there. I mean, grow it and then sell it or make it available to people and teach them to cook as well. I mean, teach people how to cook.
Awesome, yeah, that's a great idea.
One question I had, and then I know there's another question in the audience here, is I was invited to one of the design meetings, and one of the questions that was being asked was about the name, because people have a real strong reaction to the name. And I just wondered, Shanti, some of the reflections that came up in those meetings that you might be able to share. I know that there's no decision as of yet, but just some of the thinking going on.
Yeah, that's a good point. The name is definitely a big part of the discussion. And I think, again, there's nothing's been decided on, but there's a lot of focus on maintaining the historic integrity of the space. That it is the Johnson County Historic Poor Farm. Every county in the state of Iowa had a poor farm. And to lose, and I know I'm pretty sure the Johnson County Historic Society has a strong thought about the historic integrity. We don't want to lose that, we don't want to lose that part of it at all. I think there's some concern from the community that if it is still called the poor farm, and if there's elements that are geared more towards limited resource social services, there's talk about potential low-income housing out there that involves agriculture. There's a lot of different ideas that there's a stigma attached to that name, and we want to limit the opportunities that could be presented there with the name. So with that being said, there's no real idea yet. I think some of the ideas have been thrown around are a hybrid, maybe calling it like the historic Johnson County or Johnson County Farm, like previous historic poor farm, making sure that it's acknowledged in the name. But do you have any thoughts on the name?
Not necessarily on the name. I will say when you bring up the stigma of the poor farm and asylum, and I've realized this now interpreting it now that Grow Johnson County has events out there and there's people out there, there's volunteers. It's not just people who are contacting JCHS to take a tour or ask questions over the phone. So we've had people who otherwise never would have thought, because maybe of the name or just not even thought it might have been of interest. And so with Grow Johnson County, and I know TACO has done a lot of things out there and plan on doing so in the future, it's bringing these folks out there to immerse themselves in this history and kind of shy away from the stigma that is attached to the name. And it's kind of a task when you give a tour, interpretive tour at the poor farm is trying to really fully explain what it is and why it's been important to the county to continue to save it. So the name does have a lot to do with it, but we also don't want to let the name fall to the wayside either. So I don't really have opinion on what the name should be, but I definitely think, kind of a semicolon type situation or something like that where, we all know this is the historic Poor Farm, and we're fortunate that our county has been, known to save it because it is a very important part of our mental health history.
I'll always get the semicolon.
Yeah.
So first of all, just to comment, another potential partner is Uptown Bills. They have done art shows and poetry readings for the mentally ill. My question is, I'd like to know more about the dairy barn. What period has been preserved, and how much is there, and does it have good potential as a museum?
I believe the Dairy Barn has great potential to be sort of a museum, or at least part of the tour. All of the stanchions, everything is still in there. It's pretty good intact. It's in pretty good condition compared to the other one, I would say. They've done some work on some of the siding, but it would be a really interesting addition to the interpretation of the site. I definitely think it would be a great place to, whether we're telling the story of, mental illness in that space, or if we tell the story of agriculture in Johnson County, you could kind of, tell the mental health history in the asylum portion, and then kind of talk about agriculture history in Johnson County and the state of Iowa, and Dairy Barn, that kind of stuff. So, but exactly, I can give you the date. I've got it here. It's 20th century. Yeah, it's 1912. So,
It's
yeah.
been reconfigured. It's not in its original. It's not in its original configuration. So I guess the
No.
question is, what do you go back to, particularly with a milk house that was in there that is pretty well haphazard right now, and it's not helping preserve the building because there's insulation in the walls, and so I guess that's the question. Just what period and what functioning part of it do you want to go to?
I'm coming from just pure aesthetics, not historic preservation or even, it has an incredible hayloft. Has anyone ever been to Seed Savers Exchange? And their preserved barn, it's a similar style, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, it's a similar style barn in that it has the built-in hayloft in the top. There's actually a built-in stage area. I don't know what that stage was historically.
That stage is actually, it was open underneath that. It's not built on top of the floor of the loft.
Okay.
It's actually structural. And at one time, it was high. They had high doors on the end, and they could drive large wagons underneath that all the way through.
Okay.
So that's part of the reconfiguration, is they added a ceiling under it to make
I
it
see.
contiguous to the rest of the barn inside.
Okay. So yeah, that's why I'm coming purely aesthetic. Yeah. It looks like a concert should happen there tomorrow.
Yeah. Great space.
And the acoustics are great. So but again, I don't know what the actual opportunity, that's more of my brainstorming, because being at the Seed Savers Barn, they host a lot of events and concerts there, and it's just a beautiful space. So.
Shanti, could you describe a little bit the dance MFA piece that was done there last spring?
Yeah, so actually a big, one of the best first collaborations we've had with the Obermann Institute was an MFA student, Tori Lawrence, did her final thesis project out at the Poor Farm, and I don't know if any of you were able to attend. It was an incredible show, and she utilized the asylum and both barns, and then the grounds around the buildings. And her piece really focused on bringing life to the history of the farm through her interpretation. It was beautiful and kind of eerie, but for me, it really did. It was so physical, I guess, seeing the life in the barns and kind of being able to imagine what it could have been like at that time. And that's, what inspires me so much about these projects is that the way that art was able to bring the past into the present and engage just people from all different backgrounds and all different walks of life. There were politicians there, lots of U of I folks, lots of community members. And again, to create that more direct physical relationship to the place and have visuals. I still can close my eyes and see the images of the dancers in the asylum and just the energy that was developed from having that relationship and that partnership with Tori. So that really, I was excited about it just in theory, but after seeing that, the opportunity for these types of events to continue out there, I think, is huge. and it's exciting that we can do it without necessarily having to conceive of this event space and put all this money in. This is just using the space as is and using the creativity of our community to breathe more life into the space. So,
Right, thank you. So I want to segue into the next piece of this, and I want us to segue with cake. So if anybody's going to say no to that, I'm sorry, but and I'll come up front here. So we're going to show a very short documentary that Anna, you want to come up and get started. So Anna Swanson graduated with her MFA in Cinematic Arts last spring. Yes. And she was a Graduate Institute fellow, and she was also our senior fellow. So she participated in the Graduate Institute in multiple ways. And last year, she tagged along and like filmed everything we did. I don't know how many hours of film that you had. But while Anna's kind of getting set up, and then after she's set up, I'll let her introduce herself in the film a little bit more. I invite you all to help yourself to a piece of chocolate raspberry ganache cake from Deluxe Bakery. And this is in honor of C. Esco Obermann. So Esco Obermann provided the endowment for the Obermann Center, and today is actually the anniversary of his passing in 1999. I brought a copy of his obituary if anybody's interested in learning more. He actually has 3 different degrees from the University of Iowa, a BA in poli-sci, a master's degree in education, and a PhD in psychology and speech pathology, and helped start the University House in 1978. And so we just wanted to take a moment to honor his memory and thank him for what he's done for the center and making programs like this possible. So let's go ahead and segue into cake, and then please come back and watch this delightful short film about this great program. Thank you.
So as Jennifer mentioned, I'm Anna. I did the Obermann Graduate Institute in 2015 and was a senior fellow in 2016. And part of that fellowship was being tasked with making some oral histories, and that quickly grew into this very huge and wonderful film project. And in the process of working on that, Jennifer did some great interviews, as well as Jessica, who's here representing in the back. And through the iCrew Fellowship, I was lucky enough to have an undergraduate assistant editor, Freya, who has gone on to be a huge part of the Obermann Center this year, is what I've heard. So just connections happening all over. So this film is about 16, 17 minutes long. It does have a lot of footage of the historic Poor Farm, and sort of takes place right before and like as all of the things that you heard about today were starting to happen in terms of the connections. So it's both about that particular iteration of the Institute and the sort of history of the 10 years of the Institute leading up to that and how it sort of came to be. So enjoy.